Hey, welcome back to the Cycle World Podcast. I'm Mark Hoyer. I'm with Kevin Cameron, our technical editor. This podcast is about the 5-6 greatest motorcycles and the technology, the hinge of fate, as Kevin was saying, that changed everything afterward. So we have a great list, and might be some drinking involved, folks, because there's a few things that we tend to bring up. So we'll just let that happen organically. The podcast is brought to you by Octane Lending, our parent company. We appreciate their support. This podcast would not be happening without them. So click the link in the description, and you can shop for a motorcycle and potentially get pre-qualified. Go to your dealer with the ability to purchase. Makes it quick and easy. So please check that out. It helps us. Every click on that link is helpful. And if you're in the market to buy, think of Octane for getting that financing taken care of. So let's get on with the podcast. It's the 5, 6, or 7 greatest. I told Kevin I'm going to slide one in. But we're going to start at the bottom. Do you want to kick it off, Kevin? And
Sure. The first motorcycle is the new Werner, just after 1900, because it was not clear at first. You're standing there, you've got a bicycle, and in another hand, you've got one of those little de Dion Bouton singles with an atmospheric intake valve, and it can run up to 2,000 or 3,000 RPM. It's a remarkable little thing. It makes about a horsepower, a horsepower and a half. And you're thinking, where do I put this? In a bicycle frame. And we know that there have been some off-the-wall things that have actually made it to production. Notable among which is the Solex moped that made the streets of Paris slippery for so many years with its two-stroke exhaust, mounted on top of the front wheel, driving it through a little roller. So a front drive.
No, those are amazing. The Velocelix, little package that you put on the front, and like you said, it drives through a roller. You get quite a gear reduction with your little roller on your great big wheel. And
sure, turn that roller down on the lathe, freeze the rubber, and away you go. Also, we remember the Magola, which had a 5-cylinder radial built into the front wheel.
I have seen one of those run on the stand. It is a thing of beauty. The guy rode it over, not far, but he rode it over to a bike show at our local air museum at Santa Ana Airport, John Wayne, Orange County Airport. We had a little bike show there, and there was the Magola doing its 5-cylinder thing, hucking oil off as it would.
Yes.
But woven into the spokes. Nuts.
Such a bold concept. It didn't go anywhere. And a great many companies, including Honda in the very beginning, made clip-on engines that attached to one side of the rear wheel.
Yeah, Cucciolo.
Yeah, and you could buy the engine. You already had the bicycle. Follow the easy steps in the directions, and away you go. There were also motorcycles built with the engine cantilevered out behind the rear wheel. Now, the only reason I can think of for this is to free up the pedals, because all these low-powered early bikes called for what they called LPA, light pedal assistance. And the coming of clutches and 3-speed gearboxes came from the violent efforts of athletic young men huffing and puffing at the LPA until they could taste blood. But what New Werner, the two Werner brothers, came up with was to put the engine directly above where the bicycle's bottom bracket, the pivot for the crank wheel. And some people had it against the front down tube. Some people, Indian, had theirs sort of climbing the seat post. But in that opening in the frame, is where the engine ended up. And so we've talked about how the bicycle and the little internal combustion engines made under OTTO license by the two Frenchmen, the Count and his mechanicien, Georges Bouton. They had built 20,000 of them by 1900, and they went all over the world, and they were the seeds from which so many motorcycles eventually grew. Because if you were someplace working in a machine shop, if you were part of the railroad, if you were involved with bicycle racing, this message was going to reach you. And so that was the beginning of a lot of manufacturing of light motorbikes, which would eventually become proper motorcycles.
Well, the De Dion solved a lot of the basic running problems, did it not?
Yeah.
I mean, it became, that would be the hardest, if you're a bicycle maker, you're maybe not an engine designer, and you don't really know what this newfangled thing is, internal combustion engines, and to have someone deliver you a compact package that was reliable enough, ready to go, that you could pop into whatever you're making. Yeah, that was very freeing. It's the way, it's sort of the way electric parts are now. You can buy, control units and battery packs to your specification, however many you want to think you put on there, and
plug and play.
Just bring your cables. None of that CCA stuff, copper coated aluminum. Don't do it, folks.
It's wonderful.
I know, it's crazy to think that you can make CCA, that copper plating aluminum is somehow viable versus just regular old copper cable. But copper's pretty dear these days. The ore percentages have gone way down. We used to take big chunks of it out, and now we're taking out billions of tons of ore to get a little copper dust. So keep recycling, folks. Well, that's amazing. What I don't know, you were talking about Daimler as well in that conversation about
in that period.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that the motorcycle did was it allowed people who couldn't afford the equivalent of $200,000 US for a motor car. Motor cars were built to order, and there was no such thing yet as a Model T or a production line. They were all built by hand, piece by piece. So the motorcycle or motorbike, the little motorbike, was a whiff of motorized transportation that a great many more people could afford. And it turned out in England, where Henry Ford did not make his invention of the production line with interchangeable parts, that motorcycle registrations in the 1920s were frequently higher than those for automobiles. So the motorcycle was a sort of equalizer. It brought internal combustion into the hands of a lot of people. And they very quickly found out, of course, you take a bicycle and instead of the 1/10 of a horsepower that the average bicyclist is prepared to push, you put in 1.5 horsepower or a couple of horsepower, and pretty soon hitting bumps is going to interfere with the steering, and it may even break a fork right off. So they had to reinforce the fork. They had to add front suspension quite quickly. Rear suspension, not needed. Because if you were willing to go through all of this stuff, the thumping that you were getting on your behind and the frequency of having to go to the gents wouldn't bother you. It was all a glorious new undertaking. So these machines were changing rapidly. One of the applications was for pacing indoor bicycle races. And they built these machines with engines up to 4.5 liters. I think Boucher in France built a tremendous parallel twin, and it would pack its way around the bicycle track with a presumably somebody on the back to punch them up or whatever they had to do in those days before NASCAR, and set the pace for bicycle races. Chuck, 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 chuck. 4.5 liters. So, first thing is the little motors from the Dion put the technology in everybody's hand. Everybody had bicycles were, hundreds of thousands of bicycles built since 1895. It had been a huge craze. So the world was fertile ground upon which these seeds of motorcycle growth could fall. We know that, for example, Glenn Curtis sent away like box tops plus 25 cents and bought a set of castings. And then he and Charlie Kirkham went over to Charlie's dad's machine shop, and they machined the castings and built their own little engine, which nearly propelled him into the lake. And his response to this was to order the next larger set of castings. And before long, of course, you know that Glenn Curtis got into the airplane business and was making air-cooled, well, sort of, V8 aircraft engines, and built lots of stuff for the British during World War I. And he just wore himself out. That's what he said toward the end of his life. He said, "We burnt the candle, both ends in the middle, and there's not a lot of me left." But it was fun. I'm sure it was a very entertaining madness.
So you're giving the new Werner credit for the Eugene and Michel,
yeah,
Michel Werner to position the engine where we have it today, basically.
Other people made the experiments. Lauren and Clement in East Europe did a similar series and came up with the same conclusion. And it certainly makes sense. You can't have the thing up high. If the engine has any mass, it's going to be top heavy. You can't have it hanging out the back, because if you aren't much of a scorer on the scales, you've built a teeter-totter. And it just made good sense that the engine should be in the center, where it remains today.
Yeah. What I love about this is that this is 1900, and we've got a little whiffing single going with a atmospheric intake valve, which is that the suction of the intake stroke pulls open a very weak springed intake valve. There's no cam. It's just waiting for signal to pull it open.
Things, I'm told, used to make strange chittering noises. They bounced on their seat and sounded like some small creature was at work. But it was by 1903, I think it was a Dutch company that added a second push rod and apparatus to mechanize the intake valve. And so the so-called IOE, or intake over exhaust combustion chamber, was born. The cylinder and the valve box and the head were all cast in one piece. And in order to machine the valve area, there was a hole bored and threaded into the valve chamber, and then the tool goes in and cuts the 45-degree valve seat, and you also bore for the valve guide. So then the little cap that screws in to cover the hole has the intake valve in it. And up on the top is this wee little rocker arm, and there were a great many Harleys built that were IOE. And it persisted for many years. It was a workable situation.
Well, you could get a Rover until the later 60s. It was intake over exhaust, like Land Rovers.
Oh, yeah.
rover, I think the P5, so-called P5, was still running inlet over exhaust, and all the motorcycles, of course. Harley was doing JDs and stuff, and then the 45 came out in competition with the Scout, and that was a flathead 750 to was not inlet over exhaust, so it was both.
That's
both
a side
valves,
valve, a proper side valve, yeah.
proper side valve, parallel next to each other in a great big combustion chamber. But we're wandering off, as often is the case. So where I was going with is that this is 1900 with this little chuffing single, and then the next bike on our list, number 2, is the Gilera Rondine, or Rondine as we would say in America. And this is we had an entire podcast about this recently. It's a transverse inline 4 of 1923. So just 20 years later, engines transverse 4-cylinder across the frame in the place that it is today. This is the blueprint for the inline 4-cylinder racing sport bike.
This is the granddad. Yep.
And that was only 20 years, and that these two, what'd you call them, fresh baked engineering grads?
Yeah, they must have had some money and access to shop and so forth as they built this thing, and it had some modern features such as center drive, so there would be nothing overhanging the end of the crankshaft to make the engine wider. The first design was a little hokey, but they built version after version. And they were assisted by some Italian noblemen who saw this vigorous operation going and helped out. And so what really happened here is that the concept of the transfer... Oh, wait a minute. Let me back up a little bit. FN, Fabrique Nationale, which is a manufacturer of firearms in Belgium, made a motorcycle with the 4 cylinders longitudinal. And it was air-cooled. So heat from the first 3 cylinders was blowing on the 4th cylinder, which, as long as the engine didn't make too much power, it could manage. But that long engine made the wheelbase so great that on the horse manure bespeckled streets of Europe, if it rained and you got the back tire moving sideways, it was very hard to stop. And this was at the time referred to as the dreaded side slip. So this was another goal of the two fresh-baked engineers, was to have a proper motorcycle wheelbase. And so the concept went from Gilera to MV in 1950, and then Honda built their RC160, which was a Transverse 4, in 1959. And in 1969, Honda produced a production Transverse 4-cylinder motorcycle. So 4-cylinder engines for the masses. They sold the daylights out of them. So it was quite a series of intensive developments, and Gilera did a lot of the work, along with Piero Taruffi and the original engineers, plus Giuseppe Gilera saying constantly, "Let's see some results." So when they won the European Championship in 1939, beating BMW, with their liquid-cooled, supercharged Transverse 4, it got people's attention.
Amazing. So let's see. You mentioned FN. That was where I was going. You mentioned FN being a weapons manufacturer, and that was a thing. BSA, British Small Arms.
Yes.
Enfield. They had the accurate machining operations and metallurgy, and why not? Let's
And the skilled people operating
yeah,
the machine, so that when a new trend came along, you could just say, we could make those. Yeah.
yeah, pretty cool. Well, it's a beautiful bike, the Rondine. We have a nice illustration by Jim Hatch, who's done a lot of work for us over the years that we use to illustrate that story, and it's also on the thumbnail of that particular video. So if you haven't seen that video or listened to that podcast, search it out. It's the blueprint by which our modern sport bikes were made. And
Yep.
so we have Yamaha R1s essentially start because of a bike in 1923. Proof of concept.
Yep.
All right, next up, we have the third pick is a little obscure. Unlike a new Werner or Rondine, that's what Kevin said. It's a little obscure. It's the Benelli 250, and this was very interesting. This is pretty good. Set us off here, Kevin, because this is good stuff.
On the one hand, we're all familiar with how Britain developed its great singles between the two world wars. It's a wonderful story, and it brought us the Manx Norton, the BSA Gold Star, which did so many things so well in U.S. racing, the matchless G50 and AJS 7R, and the many Velocet racing singles. And interestingly enough, when Velocet decided to quit with their two-stroke, which had been the backbone of their production, and move in the direction of the market, they decided, if we're going to make a four-stroke, let's give it an overhead camshaft, because that is the current state of the art. Now, motorcycles throughout their history have tended, because motorcycles don't cost as much as cars, to be a little late in adopting technologies like a free engine clutch, which allows you to stop and restart without restarting the engine. Kind of handy.
Well, in the Magola, with the 5-cylinder radial inside the front wheel, there was no clutch, and the instruction manual said circle at the circle at the stop. Just
wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, there's no neutral.
Will come down, and you'll be able to cross.
No neutral. So
yep. Overhead cam had been present in automobile racing since before 1910. So all these things were well established in the automotive area, but motorcycles being depending on their cheapness to appeal to a lot of people were slow at adopting things like a magneto in place of a battery and a condenser and all those things. I looked at an Orient motorcycle that was made in Waltham, Massachusetts, ages and ages ago. And the condenser, to prevent its contact system from arcing, was two pieces of glass with aluminum foil between them.
Amazing.
And no, two pieces of aluminum foil with glass between. So, a normal paper capacitor is just that same concept, but rolled up into one of those little drum shapes.
Well, I've marched into the future on SU fuel pumps, British automotive fuel pumps, diaphragm type, with a solenoid, basically a linear motor that goes bang, makes the pressure, and then the spring
pushes
the motor.
The fuel.
Yeah, the motor shaft pulls it, and then the spring regulates your fuel pressure, and it goes click, 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 click. And if you use a lot of gas, it goes click, 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 click. On the end of that shaft, going on the top of the windings, is dual points. It's 4 contacts basically, and they came with capacitors which age out. And I have marched into the future by using a transel, which is it's a transient voltage suppressor. And if you find the right values, you can use this transel, and it cuts it off as soon as the voltage goes. It chops it off, and it can't get through. It's beautiful. I ran that by an electrical engineer, and he said, "Great find, man."
Yeah.
So we wired that in. Anyways, you said Velocet earlier. I'm not sure if I say Velocet if people have to drink, or if you say it, do they have to drink? I'm not sure, but I'm going to slide my Velocet comment in here because you're talking about them adopting overhead cam and the 4-stroke and all that. Velocet is credited with the positive stop gear shift.
Yes.
Which is used on everything, because before it wasn't like that. And so positive stop foot gear shift. So we owe that.
1927.
We owe that to Velocet.
There were a lot of riders who made their shift into foot operated, but the lever didn't return to the middle position. It went neutral, 1, 2, 3, or whatever, inverted. And so it was Harold Willis at Velo who came up with this. The lever returns to the center position, and you simply notch the shifting element, a shift drum in modern engines, a shift plate in a lot of British stuff. You notch it one position. It has a series of detents that will hold it in these discrete positions. So yes, that was a great contribution from Velocet. Harold Willis was an aviator, and he enjoyed the language. He was always coming up with wonderful ways to describe natural phenomena.
Did he name Whiffling Clara?
Yes, he sure did. It was an attempt at supercharging, and when it stopped, there was a hiss that could be heard for some seconds as the pressurized intake slowly returned to atmosphere.
Well, we should get back on the Benelli 250,
yeah,
I suppose.
The big principle here is that on the one hand, the British refined the single cylinder engine by improving its breathing, tune length, intake, its exhaust, tune length, exhaust pipe, later with a megaphone to strengthen the return wave. And they also improved combustion. They found that by making the charge in the cylinder whirl around, they could store the intake energy, which the intake rushes in the engine at several hundred feet a second. They could store that energy until the moment of the spark, the ignition spark, whereupon the piston coming to top dead center, all that velocity would be turned into a tumbling mass of turbulence, which spreads the flame by shredding it and carrying it to all parts of the combustion chamber. So the British were super aces at building these very refined singles that turned around 7,000 RPM. But the formula, the outline of the formula for horsepower is displacement times RPM. RPM tells you how many times you perform the power producing cycle per minute. And then the stroke averaged net combustion pressure, that is, how hard is the piston being pushed. And that's a result of efficient combustion, a high compression ratio, which, of course, the higher you raise the compression ratio, the more you become cheek to jowl with detonation. But the Italians chose, in the form of this Benelli 250, to explore higher RPM. And Italian small bore, Italian singles, like the 125s that Mondial built, they developed their engine to run to 13,000 RPM. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot today, but in the 1950s, it was enough that they had to put in a new crankshaft each weekend. So the technology of running an engine at higher RPM, controlling the valves at a higher cyclic rate, and so forth, these were problems that the Italians tackled. And where the British chose to drive their overhead cams with a tower shaft and bevel gears, or with a chain, as in the case of the 7R or G50 singles, the Italians had a train of glorious spur gears running up one side of the cylinder. And at the top, the two big circles are the drive gears on the individual camshafts. So those motorcycles look archaic because they're cycle parts, they're ages old. But if you look at that tower of gears, and then you look at the same tower of gears on the 2025 Ducati MotoGP bike, same. So all these things have roots in the past that I find fascinating. You may just want to shut this program off and go riding, in which case you're quite welcome. But here we are. So those little singles, 125s and 250s, were the backbone of Italian high-speed engine technology. And in fact, the Gilera and later the MV four-cylinder 500s were just four of those little 125s stacked up. And when Gilera finally decided to quit at the end of 1957, their engine was producing very close to 70 horsepower at 10,500. So a little more conservative specification than the little Mondial single, but they wanted to run more than one race before having to rebuild the engine. Mind you, lots of street bikes were inspired by all of this high-end racing activity because motorcyclists are more conscious of mechanism. They're more involved with their machines than the average automobile driver. Automobile drivers, oh, it started. Good. Now I can get to work. But with the motorcycle, the symbiosis between the rider and the machine is a very rewarding one. And people like to know more about it. That's why we're here. Now, Benelli weren't the only ones. Mondial, MV also explored these high RPM singles, and NSU in Germany in the early 50s built very high RPM singles and twins. And when Mr. Honda went on his tool buying expedition in Europe, I think 1954, he bought a Mondial and he bought an NSU and brought them home for his experimental department to analyze. Now, as we know, Honda motorcycles of today are not NSUs. Some of the early ones with their valenced fenders and their short leading link forks and pressed steel frames were indeed using NSU features. But as their market research became more sophisticated, they realized that motorcycle buyers, especially in the US, had an image of what a motorcycle should look like, and that wasn't it. So presto changeo. But the idea of using high RPM to make power was absolutely central to Honda's demonstration to the world, 1959 through 1967, that you could turn four-stroke engines about as high as you could name. Their testing went out to 26 or 27,000 RPM, and their five-cylinder 125 revved to 22,000. So these.
How do you make time for combustion in that? I mean, honestly,
they were very interested in that. There was a group of people who said, well, you're going to have to advance the timing more and more until finally you're lighting it during the previous cycle. But it turns out that as you work towards higher and higher RPM, you were using smaller and smaller pistons, so the flame travel distance was shorter. And the turbulence trapped in the cylinder became more violent as everything speeded up. So combustion did not have any trouble keeping up with 22,000 RPM. And so that was the basis. High RPM, lots of little cylinders, or even somewhat bigger ones, was the basis for the late, great sport bike era, which ran from late 80s until basically the insurance companies raised their rates so that they became comparable with your payments. And after 2008, people had other uses for their money.
Well, 600s did get pretty expensive. They were sort of
getting in there for 12, 13,000, weren't they?
Yeah, it was. It was getting pretty expensive. So we do have a great crop of middleweight, sporty motorcycles. Things have gone a different direction, and it's not all bad at all. So
No, not at all, because at first the manufacturers thought, "Oh, we've got to have novelty to restart our business. We'll have huge lockable storage. That'll bring them in. How about urban mobility platform? Exciting." And they sold some of these things, maxi scooters, so on. But what people really wanted was motorcycles of the usual categories, just less expensive. So that's the direction in which it has gone. A classic way to reduce cost is to reduce parts count. So today's 270-degree parallel twins are strong, excellent, smooth running engines, providing motorcycling that we could all enjoy. So that's my spiel on RPM. Our next item on the list is the 1950 Manx Norton. And this is the motorcycle that had the so-called featherbed frame, which was designed by the Irish McCandless brothers. And what they did was to gather together the most progressive elements in motorcycle chassis and suspension and put them into one package. Telescopic fork up front, a swing arm with a broad and stiff mounting base, in this case, 2 frame loops, and hydraulic rear suspension damping, so that the damping was smooth and steady, not subject to stick slip as the old dry friction dampers were. They called them scissors dampers. And because engines had become more powerful, McCandless moved both the engine and the rider forward between 2 and 3 inches, so that they obtained greater stability. Stability begins with the front wheel. Stability comes from the footprint. The footprint gets bigger when you load it up with weight. Hence, you move those things forward. There's a great photograph showing Jeff Duke on one of the later racing Giuleras, and he's consulting with his pit people, and behind his rear, taped rather crudely to the seat stop, are 3 thicknesses of rubber padding. They have pushed him forward on the motorcycle. And the very same thing happened when Matt Mladen rode a test at Willow Springs with his new crew chief, Peter Doyle. Doyle, a very experienced man, watched Mladen ride around the circuit. And when he came in, he just went over to the bike and taped 3 inches of padding to the seat stop to push Mladen forward. So what was good in 1956 or 57 was also good in U.S. Superbike in very recent times. So these are principles that they exist in the minds of all experienced crew chiefs. what if we loaded the front a little more? What if we wanted to, what if? And they've got things to try in their minds. So another thing about the 1950 Manx was that since it was so much more capable, much more quick responding and confidence inspiring, Duke would have won the world championship first time out, 1950, if he had not suffered tread separations at Assen and Spa. Spa is a very high speed circuit. However, he came back the following year on a different make of tires and did take the world championship, after which he in turn was taken by Gilera. So, in a way, the 1950 Manx put an end to the cotton carcass tire and introduced a new era of probably nylon tire structure. Nylon is harder to make it stick to rubber. You have to put a primer on it. It's just a slippery rod of this polymer, but it's wicked strong. And with the primer on nylon fibers or rayon in other cases, they were able to make tires of a higher speed capability. So that 1950 Manx also was involved in advancing tire technology.
Well, it is the ultimate integrated system.
Yeah.
Make improvements places, and that's where you see your other weaknesses start to show.
Yeah, you fix one problem, and that allows you to advance to the next one.
Yeah, firsthand experience, 1975, Laverda 3CL with a LaFranconi factory exhaust system on it that was the diameter of a pencil coming out of the two mufflers and a little tiny collector. And I bought this expensive system and put it on there and rejetted the Delorto carburetors and went from about 50 horsepower to 70. And that's when the clutch started slipping. So, yeah, the featherbed, riding a featherbed, you hear these kinds of discussions and everyone talks about mechanless and, oh, the bike, it rides, it's like a feather bed. It's so smooth. And then you actually try a featherbed frame, which I did in a Norton Cafe Racer. And I'd had a lot of time on a Norton Commando, which is a good handling motorcycle. Norton Commando is, isolastic, which probably could be a program in itself, but, rubber mounted engine cradle with a swing arm attached to it that can move in a circular plane. And then it's, shimmed or veneered. And so it handles good. It's a nice handling motorcycle, but it isn't as incredibly sweet and wonderful as a featherbed. And so I wrote all this other vintage stuff before I tested a Norton featherbed, rode a Norton featherbed with a 750 twin in it. A ton of vibration, which is what you isolate on the isolastics. But I rode that up a winding road and I was so impressed. There's nothing like the firsthand truth of riding a motorcycle that had good shocks on it, and it had a road holder Norton fork, which was pretty good reputation, and it worked amazingly well. And I've said this on other programs, the early swinging arm, like basically 1950-ish, you started to see swing arms getting to street bikes or any rear suspension at all. It could be, Garden Gate, where the shock is kind of in a big C shape, and you put the shock in there, and then the wheel is attached.
Sliding pillar, sticking pillar.
Yeah. So, but we were starting to get suspension travel at that time, and it wasn't really that well worked out. The featherbed really worked it out. The featherbed did a very good job of taking the swing arm pivot and connecting it firmly to the steering head and giving it a reasonable swing arm. And that was a problem with bikes of that era. Like if you look at a Velocette, which is, a swing arm Velocette is a pretty good handling motorcycle, but it still has a swing arm essentially attached to what you would describe as a seat tube. It's a single vertical pipe.
Yes.
And then the arms, there's a cross pipe, and it's like a kind of crucifix-ish. It has two pipes, and then your pivot goes through the pipe, and then the arms of the swing arm clamp onto it. And my rigid Velocette was a beautiful motorcycle to ride because the axle and the steering head, there was no suspension, there was no wobbly seat tube. You had just a good strong connection. You didn't have suspension travel, but the featherbed kind of took that rigidity and gave it supple rear wheel travel. And I rode that featherbed in 2005 or something, after a long career of testing many different kinds of motorcycles. And you're like, no, this is great. This is a great sporting motorcycle. Really fun.
But if you look at a picture of a featherbed frame bare, and you'll notice that the steering head sort of sticks up, and you're saying to yourself, what braces the top of the steering head against being tucked by hard braking? Well, there's a tube that runs down to the middle of a cross tube. So if there's a pull force, this tube is going to bend in the middle. Well, originally it was attached to the cylinder head of that great big single. But people who vintage race those Nortons say that front wheel misbehavior is possible because of that flexibility in the steering head. Suzuki began to correct that in 1976 with their race bikes by running a pair of tubes from the top of the steering head all the way back to where the down tube went down to the swing arm pivot, so that the steering head was now firmly, if you braked really hard, the front wheel wasn't going to come back and kiss the crankcase. And ultimately, that bracing became the two side beams that so many motorcycles today have, and the tubes that went down under the engine atrophied away. So now the engine takes their role as a stress member in the frame. So this brings us to Yamaha TZ750.
Ha! And everybody drink.
This is another case where we could have said Kawasaki H2R 750, Suzuki TR 750 Water Buffalo, because none of those motorcycles initially was a good handling, confidence-inspiring ride, and they ate up their tires. So that just as in the 1950 McCandless frame, those fellows joined a number of elements together and made a new synthesis, so Yamaha, in the case of the D model, they added monoshock suspension at the rear in place of the original 3-inch travel, horrible individual shock absorbers. And by allowing longer suspension travel, they could prevent bottoming, and they could absorb a lot more energy without disturbing the motorcycle's stability. So that in the old days, if you were riding out of the Daytona infield at turn 5 and hitting the 31-degree banking, you would say, well, let's have all the unpleasantness at once. I'll make the upshift there. But once they went to longer travel and the greater ability to absorb chassis energy into the suspension, they could gas it through there. And this is what we want from our motorcycles. Not a lot of horrible little quirks. Oh, no, don't do that. Only on Thursday, which a lot of early motorcycles were like. You would like an overall reliable and confidence-inspiring behavior. And the riders who were frightened, frankly, by TZ750A in 1974, which wobbled and shook and did all kinds of terrible things. By 1977, when the D model came out with the advances that I've just described, those riders breathed a great sigh of relief because rather than ride the A model, they went back to their 350 twins, which were stable and confidence inspiring. The 77D model fixed that so
Well,
that
imagine, you pointed this out in our conversation, but imagine designing and delivering your 750 two-stroke that makes 100 plus horsepower, and like, we're going to dominate the world, and then you're being beaten by your own 350s. I mean,
yes,
sorry guys.
yeah,
But to have it, that's why the motorcycle was so defining, or why those motorcycles were so defining, is that they forced everything else to change to
yes.
compensate for that amount of power that they were able to make.
100 horsepower could not be transmitted through K81s of the 1960s. It required a step forward in tire design. And from Dunlop came the Speedway Special, which had what looked like little squiggles for tread grooves and was broad and had a large radius so that it wasn't just a little hard rubber wheel. It was up to the work. And for 1974, well, of course, Agostini won the Daytona 200 on that tire. And for 1974, Goodyear introduced slick tires to motorcycle racing. And the effect of the slick tire on production tires was that they were given larger footprints, they were wider, and they were belted, which prevented them from expanding at speed so that they rubbed on little bolt heads holding fenders and so forth on. And they conferred pretty decent handling on those new 100 horsepower bikes. And on the production side, using this new technology, they were able to keep up with the growth of production bike horsepower, say H2 with 74 horsepower, and then Z1 with something in the mid 80s. And so that sort of reset the relationship of tires to motorcycles, just as had happened with the 1950 Manx. So
you would say TZ750 was a heavily modified featherbed. Essentially, it was still pipe,
it's a pipe frame, yes,
Yep.
but it was to a great extent saved from the tire forces of these new tires with a lot more grip by the fact that you could run a softer spring rate on a longer travel suspension. So instead of having 3 inches of travel from your old black Girling shocks, which, by the way, were so much better than certain other shocks we won't mention, they were able to save the frame from forces that would make it auto steer, tail wagging, twisting, things like that, that ultimately caused the abandonment of the plain old style tubular frame. It's possible to make tubular frames that work really well, but they don't have as many curved tubes in them. Curved tubes bend more easily when you push and pull on the ends than do straight tubes. So I look upon TZ750, which is a motor. They built something like 575 of these bikes. No such number was built of Kawasaki's 750 Racer or Suzuki's. So that's the reason I chose this motorcycle, because it exposed so many people to how much better a 750 could be if it had long travel suspension. And it was a leader in persuading designers of street bikes to travel the same path toward improved handling.
Well, I think of I think of Harley Davidson touring bikes because they have 2 to 3 inches. The slammed ones, the baggers, have like 2
Yeah.
to 3 inches of travel that
Yeah.
they're working with, and everything that you describe is concentrated in that suspension travel. They have to do that for the look. They want, the buyer definitely wants this hunkered down, long, low look, and so they're forced, to engineer something that works really damn good. Like the 3 inch of travel that they introduced on, I think it was, it was 3 inches. That was a 50% improvement in travel because the previous model was 2 inches and this is now
2
3.
inches. Yeah.
And
The
it
rule
works.
is, yeah, that the energy that the suspension can absorb is proportional to the travel squared. So if you increase the travel by half, that's 1.5 squared, which is 2.25 times more energy can be absorbed there.
And that's some great point, because it's a huge improvement, and they work really well within those confines. I mean, I think of Harley as sort of I always think of Harley like haiku in a weird way. Like, it's poetry within the form. You have certain limitations, which is the visual signature and the look, sound, and feel. You really want the bike to give you a certain feeling, either when you're looking at it, when you're sitting on it, looking over the headlight or over the fairing. And that's the poetry within the form. And
Yeah.
they do a really great job of it. And the 3 inches of travel is remarkable. But what do you get from 5 inches? I'm doing this, and you did it mathematically. You said, oh, it's the square of the whatever. I'm here to tell you that when you have 5 inches or 4.5 inches, that you can have some sag so that you have more extension, so that when you're going over the top of something, the tire stays in contact, and then you can control your rebound, and you can control your compression damping, and you have a proper spring, and you have 5 inches. That wheel is able to stay
on the pavement.
On the pavement,
Yeah.
and give you what you want,
which is control.
Yeah. So we thank the TZ750 for turning all of our riders pale white.
Yes, it was a demon from hell with a sharp stick, and it really gave the engineers a poke. Those engineers have been snoozing. Designing 1960 stuff worked fine. 40 horsepower, no problem.
Everything's good at 60%, pretty much.
The rule is all slow bikes handle great.
Yeah, you just that's our job is to find where something starts to go wrong.
Just as when TZ750 arrived in 1974 in its first relatively crude form, it was not possible to gracefully feed 100 or 125 horsepower into the pavement through that one rear tire. And they had to get busy right then and make it possible. And it involved cooperation from the tire manufacturers and the suspension world. And they were able to do it. Later on, when the second generation of superbikes in the United States, the first generation was the sit-ups, wobbling and calling upon their upright riders to do impossible things.
Freddie Spencer famously bending the handlebars on his 750 Honda.
Are we thinking of Eddie Lawson? Are we thinking of Wayne Rainey? The second generation of superbikes, and indeed the second generation of sporting Japanese motorcycles, was greatly influenced by their experience in racing. It used to be originally all these departments in these big corporations were separate, and they had their own space at lunchtime. They talked their own little talk. Who are those other fellows? And these big problems forced them to use the knowledge that their racing departments were getting, and their discussions with tire companies, their discussions with suspension manufacturers because they knew they had to do something because
Well, I think
someone was going to come up with an answer.
that evolution in racing, you had a lot of talented engineering people at your Hondas and Suzukis and Kawasaki's and Yamahas and all that. A lot of talent and so much innovation. And look at the products that we ended up with. Just miracles of performance and reliability.
Yes.
I mean, insane performance. The Suzuki Hayabusa, like, just imagine trying to tell someone like who's riding a TZ 750, like, no, it's Hayabusa. You have 160 horsepower, 100 pound-feet of torque in a chassis that works. Like all of that coming together. You had all that engineering. What I was thinking of is they're hiring experienced racing people also to work with the teams, people who had a long history of being problem solvers, somebody like Cal Carruthers or Kanemoto, and certainly even earlier than that, crew chiefing. And essentially, that's really the job of that person, is to bring all of the disciplines together to focus on the actual problem and the many things that you might need to solve it. And that's certainly something that appears to have made its way into the performance industrial complex of
one of my
Japanese
favorites.
manufacturers.
One of my favorites was the one that I was told some years ago about testing an extremely powerful Japanese motorcycle on the secret test road at night. And the motorcycle had just run 194 miles an hour or some frightening number. And it sat there idling afterwards, dum, 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 as if I could do that all day. What do you want now?
I tell you what, man, my first long-term test bike at Soccer World, I went on the press launch for the Suzuki Hayabusa at Circuit de Catalunya, and then we did 190 miles an hour on the freeway on our, I forget, they called it road touring, I think.
Yes.
And then the German guy's like, yeah, just, the guy, so Suzuki was pretty big in the German market, and they were leading the ride, the guy from Suzuki Germany. And he's like, please to obey all the traffic laws, and then just peeled a big old smoke and burn out of the parking lot. And in 5 minutes we were on the freeway, tapped in 6th gear, just a huge pack of copper gold Hayabusas. So that was the press launch I did at Cycle News, and then I was just not long after that hired at Cycle World, and they handed me a Hayabusa long-term test bike.
Yeah.
And I mean, what a time to what a time to be alive. It was amazing.
Right.
And so the point of the story is, we got 191 miles an hour at Cycle News. Cycle World got 194. Don Canet, the radar gun, is just in the next room that we used for that. And 194 miles an hour, 986 and a quarter at 146 miles an hour, and a incredibly well-balanced chassis, and a motorcycle that was capable of incredible hop-up. I had that bike. I rode it roughly 12,000 miles as my long-term test bike. I'd put some pipes on it. I took it to track days. I didn't crash it. I did run it off at one track day. Then I rode up to Thunder Hill. I left at 5, got there. It's like an 8-hour ride or something. Went to bed, did 2 days at the track with a Jason Pridmore Star School. And then rode it back Sunday night after the track day. And that's what I did with that motorcycle for the year and a half that I had it. And then we're wrapping up the test, and we take it to Carlsbad along with the ZX-12R, which was the kind of Kawasaki's big bore sport bike answer. It was harder, taller. It was more sport bikey, and less like a big cruise missile. So we were testing that bike because I was riding the road test on that, and I met Don Canet down at Carlsbad when we were still using that for drag strip testing, and I rode the Hayabusa down and said, hey, can we run this? I'm wrapping it up. And he did a 989 at 148 after 12,000 miles.
After 12,000 miles.
And it just idled. Like, it did not burn oil. Like, I never added oil to that motorcycle. and we wring the daylights out of it. I mean, we don't abuse the motorcycles, but we use them hard. And it was, I don't know what else to say. It was perfect.
Did
And
the job.
it did exactly what it was doing. Then I was leaving. We'll get back to the last bike, I promise. But I was leaving the drag strip because I was writing the test on the ZX12. I'm like, I'll take this bike. I was in the South County area, and there's some great roads down in eastern, San Diego County, and you can go out to Lake Henshaw and all this stuff. I'm like, hey, I'm gonna ride the ZX12 away and start my test, road test procedure and all that. And I'm tuned up because I run at the drag strip, and then I'm leaving the track, and a Corvette, a GS, a Goldstrand Corvette with the little stripes on the fender pulls up and like throws me revs. And I'm like, oh, buddy, you picked a terrible day to do this, because I was already tuned up to
Yeah.
launch the bike and all of that. And I was on, something that was pretending to the throne of the highest performance, motorcycle on the market. And so I smoked them, and they give me a hat tip. So, lights went green and I was gone. I would have liked to tell them that story. Anyway, let's move on to the it's the 6th of the 5 greatest motorcycles. We were debating how many we should pick, and we just decided that this was good. And it's the Honda RC211V.
That's the bike that they built for the beginning of MotoGP. And Mr. Ikenoya announced at the outset, MotoGP will use normal technology, nothing exotic, superbike level, and it will be very reliable and excellent. And of course, they had their 990cc engine, and in the early testing, the test rider gave it a rating of 2 out of 10. He said, the motorcycle is unrideable. Well, it was unrideable because now they were trying to put twice as much power through one tire as the TZ750A had done. Actually, more than twice. And when you tune engines, their power becomes narrower and their torque curve develops features. There are places where the torque is increasing rapidly. And it's very hard to accelerate off a corner when the torque is accelerating as well as the motorcycle, because suddenly the horsepower at the rear tire doubles and you're sideways, oh, I'm in the gravel. So they had to do a lot of work on the motorcycle to civilize it, to make it human rideable. And the other manufacturers, of course, were going through the same thing, but we do have information about Honda's trajectory through this morass of problems. And what they discovered was that they could smooth the power band by creating what's called a virtual power band. If the real power band has a sub peak and then jumps up to peak torque and then falls off gradually, you don't want that strange characteristic. So what you do is you program in movement of the throttle that is not commanded by the rider. So the throttle plates are moving constantly to take out that dip, because when it starts to dip, the throttle's open and fill the dip in. When the peak is too steep, the throttles close. And this is programmed into the system so that every time the engine accelerates through those RPM, that those throttle movements will be performed. And
that's
the idea comes from Formula One, and it's a wonderful concept because it allows you to go on tuning for greater power within certain limits, knowing that you can go back and smooth the torque curve electronically. Now, the old gentleman, I'm one now, the old gentleman at that time hated it. I'm going to rip the electronics out. We're going to go back to the way things were. And they didn't, because there wasn't a way to do it. Now, Certain riders have said that they rode with no electronics, but that means they turned down the anti-wheelie and they turned down the torque control somewhat. But nobody rode them naked with the 100% natural power band of the engine unleashed. And today, of course, power has risen toward 300 horsepower instead of the 200 or 220 horsepower of those early days, 2002. So to keep feeding more and more power into that same size tire requires that you eliminate the suddenness, the parts of the torque curve that are going to yank the tire loose and cause it to spin, cause you to slip sideways, cause you possibly to high side. And this is what is behind the electronic controls that now so many motorcycles have, in particular the more powerful ones, because this is how you can transmit 220 horsepower, 250 horsepower, 300 horsepower through a single tire and not have created something that rates a 2 out of 10.
Well, you want
So,
as a rider, you want that predictable response. You want the torque. You're looking at a target torque for I'm moving my hand this much and I know exactly what I'm going to get, and it
yeah,
isn't going to surprise me the way that 500 two-stroke would, spooling up and just doubling its horsepower over 500 RPM or something insane. That's why everybody got high-sided, because
yeah.
they were trying like crazy to be that torque predictor, and
I asked Loris Capirossi during the time that he rode Suzuki MotoGP bike about this, and he said, if you switch off the electronics, this motorcycle is unrideable, worse than a 500 two-stroke. And that is not because four strokes aren't naturally smoother than two strokes. It's just that all engines, as you tune them towards more power, begin to show more roughness, more character, little flat spots, zones of sudden torque increase. And if you can't win championships with power that's turned down to the point that the rider can control it, then you have to have something other than the rider to control it. And that was the role of the RC211V, was that it put the question, can a human being connected to the throttles by means of a traditional steel throttle cable control 220 horsepower? And the answer that they discovered was no.
no.
And that's why this motorcycle is one of the hinge points in the development of motorcycling, because it essentially said, if we're going to build these very powerful bikes, we're going to have to provide systems that will make them rideable by human riders. So
Both
that's
of
why I picked
average
that one.
talent, both of
Yes,
average talent and of world level talent. It's
there was
certainly a world.
I had a wonderful conversation with a Honda engineer who said, when we planned the 904 Fireblade, originally we thought, so much power in a lightweight motorcycle, maybe this will cause trouble for riders who have average skills. So they decided to develop a rideability index and a set of questions by which to quantify the rideability or lack of it. And when they had a satisfactory scheme, they presented it to both street riders and to racers. Both of them preferred the high rideability engine. Now, what this exposes is that we have become accustomed to the idea that race bikes are really hard to ride. The engines are so powerful, they'll just run away with you. The fact is
They are.
that, yes, they are. And that is not desirable. That is working against the rider. So when those professional riders rode the high rideability motorcycle, they went around the circuit more quickly because they knew what the engine was going to do, that it wasn't suddenly going to do the TZ750A, the torque doubled at 9,300 RPM.
Yeah. My
Bang!
recent experience on a BMW two different BMW M1000 double Rs. One was just a street bike, had the top rack livery on it, and the other was Nate Kern, who races in Super Hooligan and has a M1000R, like a Alpha Racing stock 1000 bike. So highly developed,
Yep.
great electronics, and they had loaded Jason Uribe, who was second in the championship. They had loaded his like end of season control scheme, all the bringing in the cylinders one at a time on the side of the tire.
Yeah.
All of this stuff. And I rode that Alpha bike. The turn in was better than the stocker. It was a race bike. It was on better tires as well. But what was remarkable about it is, like, I was riding this at Barber, and you go in the last corner, you do a kind of a slow right, and then you're rolling it over to the left, and then you're driving onto the front straight, and you're leaned over well, and you roll into the throttle, and you can hear the motorcycle adding a cylinder, and the motorcycle does not move. So you're leaned over, and you're rolling it in, and you're adding, I'm asking for this, but the bike, I had the controls set kind of on more moderate than somebody like Jason Uribe or Nate Kern would have, but you could hear it. And as soon as you started to pick up, it was perfectly smoothly adding power and incredible drive. And they are still hard to ride in the sense that, you have to be especially with all the forces, you just have to have a base level fitness of being able to hang on, being able to brake, not having carpal tunnel, make your hands disappear, all that. But it's such a remarkable thing to have that now, because the bike was rideable and incredible, and the electronic schemes, as we talked about with Albanese, what's his first, Romano
Albesiano.
Albesiano.
Romano Albesiano, yeah.
Formerly of Aprilia MotoGP, and talking about the throttle pickup mapping was to take the slop out of the gears, so that if you're decelerating, the throttle is closed, and then you're coming back, one of the first things that they would do was
Take up in the opposite direction. Yeah.
Get rid of the slack, put all the gear train and all the slack, take that away with perfect smoothness, so that it doesn't upset that very fine traction that the rider is maintaining with that lateral force and a lot of lean angle.
And often there's only 3 dogs on each gear, so there's quite a backlash angle from the engaging dogs. So there's room for the thing to give a fair size clunk. You don't want a clunk. You want to load the tires consistently.
We give credit to the RC211V for kind of beginning that revolution for us and controlling the massive amount of power we have available. We went to 800s, that didn't last, and now what's our next round? I think we're kicking down to the displacement again. 850.
But they're keeping the same stroke. So the hope there is that, unlike the 800 thing that began, 2006, end of 2006, RPM went right to 20,000. And everyone's saying, oh my God, it's an expensive RPM race. This is terrible. So they've kept the same stroke, 48.5 millimeters, as with the 1000s that have ruled since 2012. And this is hoped to be the rev limiter that Honda's Shuhei Nakamoto would never let them have. Pick one, he said. Rev limiter, Honda. Your choice. And in those days, Honda had clout.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was 6 of the 5 greatest motorcycles that changed technology. Thank you for listening, folks. We appreciate the comments and everything. It's always cool. A lot of good conversations going out there and topics coming in. So we'll see you in the comments. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.